Ladies and gentlemen, please help me in welcoming Gregory Lopez and Massimo Pigliucci. You got it.
Thanks, Phil. So today we are here to discuss what is beyond Stoicism. And there are a couple of answers to that question. The main one being it is the title of Massimo, mine, and Meredith Alexander Kunz's new book, Beyond Stoicism, at least the English title version of it, which you see on the right-hand side of your screen. It has a different title, but it's the same book in the UK, Live Like a Philosopher. But we're here to discuss some of the ideas in that book overall. But we're also here to discuss what actually is beyond Stoicism to some degree. So part of it is that it is the publisher's choice for a title. It was not our original title for it, but in a sense, it does convey a couple of messages that are interesting to ponder. The first is, does this mean that somebody who's a practicing Stoic can find some stuff in this book that could be of value? And hopefully the publisher won't see this too much, but one answer to this question is possibly there's possibly nothing for practicing Stoics who are satisfied with their practice, or people who are into Stoicism and want to practice can also refer to Massimo and my previous book, A Handbook for New Stoics, in order to get Stoic practical exercises. So in a sense, beyond Stoicism could be seen as a bit of a misnomer. It's not like Stoicism only goes so far and then flops on its face and you need extra stuff in order to go forward. However, for some practicing Stoics, there may be something. We've had a couple of interesting conversations where taking a look at some of the practices that the ancient Stoics did, it seems apparent that some are more grounded in Stoic theory than others. And this means that if you take your Stoic practice to, for instance, mirror Epictetus's three disciplines, where it's kind of a training program in theory areas that's meant to be somewhat progressive. The first being the discipline of desire, where one works on one's passions. Passions are a subset of emotions that cause you to be antisocial and anti-rational to some degree. That's the first step. The second step is the discipline of action, where one learns to act intentionally and what we would call in the modern parlance ethically in the world a little bit more, although there's problems with that term we could get into possibly later. And then the third discipline is the discipline of assent. And so any practice that kind of helps the goals of those disciplines can, in a sense, be Stoic. And in that sense, perhaps you will find in other ancient Greco-Roman traditions some practices that you are able to take into your own Stoic practice. And the books overall go over what we consider the large majority of practicable Greco-Roman philosophies, because there were a lot of competitors to Stoicism in the world, in that world. And also, there may be some people for whom Stoicism is a poor fit. In my opinion, Stoicism came into the modern public consciousness somewhat by accident. A series of historical contingent factors that could have turned out differently. And in another possible close parallel world, Epicureanism or maybe even Cyrenaicism could have come to the fore. And so a lot of people come to Stoicism for reasons that Stoicism is actually not well suited for. It's not its aim necessarily. A lot of people come to Stoicism because of emotional upset. And while reducing emotional upset is a side effect of Stoic practice, it's actually not the point of it. But there are some philosophies that are more well suited to dealing with that in the ancient Greco world. So I'm going to turn it over to Massimo in order to start describing the structure of a book along with the different philosophies that somebody could possibly practice in the modern world.
Thanks, Greg. So what we did when we decided, finally, the three of us to get our heads together and write a book about classical and Hellenistic philosophies of life, basically, one of the big questions was, how do we organize this thing? One of the first things we learned, for instance, from our publisher is that publishers absolutely don't like authors to refer to these kind of things as a survey. So, a survey of Hellenistic philosophy. Survey is boring. Nobody wants a survey. So it's an exploration. It's a voyage instead. And the obvious thing, of course, would have been to organize things chronologically, and that also would have been pretty boring. I mean, it's obvious. You can go through the various philosophies from the pre-Socratics to the Neoplatonists and cover, almost 1,000 years of the history of philosophy. But there is no rhyme or reason to it, because the different schools emerged different times and sometimes simultaneously competed with each other, as Greg was saying. And so it's like that didn't make a lot of sense. So what we decided to do instead is the kind of charting of the waters that you're about to see in this slide. And that is, we identified what we call 3 ports. So using the navigation metaphor, which is a metaphor that it's actually used by a lot of ancient philosophers themselves, certainly the Stoics. And we identified these 3 ports. The first port is that of pleasure. This is one way of looking at the overall sort of overarching idea that guides your life, pleasure. 2 ancient philosophies fall into that category, Cyrenaicism and Epicureanism. I'll talk about those in a minute. The second port is that of character or virtue. So these are character or virtue-centered philosophies: Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Cynicism, and Platonism. The third port is that we call the port of doubt, that is skepticism. There are 2 kinds of skeptical ancient schools: the academic skeptics, which were a group of skeptics that kind of took over for a period Plato's academy after Plato's death, and then Pyrrhonism. But also we put into that category sophism. At least some of the sophists, like Protagoras, for instance, were clearly skeptical in the sense that we're talking about here, and Socrates. I mean, after all, in fact, almost all of these schools either define themselves with respect to Socrates or in antagonism to Socrates. And definitely the academic skeptics thought of themselves as Socratic. I mean, they were, after all, part of the Platonic school. So they thought of themselves as emphasizing a major strand of thought in Socrates. And then finally, there is another group of philosophies: Pythagoreanism, Megarianism, and Neoplatonism, some of which, I don't know how many people have heard of even Megarianism. You probably have heard of Pythagoras, although, as we argue in the book, probably from the wrong reasons, because a lot of the things that are attributed to Pythagoras were not actually done by Pythagoras, or at least there is no good historical evidence that was the case. Now, these schools are more heterogeneous. They don't really fit into any of the other 3 categories very, very neatly. And so we used the phrase "here be dragons" to identify these waters. The phrase was used in medieval maps of the world to indicate areas that are unknown and or potentially treacherous, potentially dangerous. So these are the 3 that we put into that area. And I'm going to very briefly go through sort of highlights of all of these, just to give you a sense of flavor of what of how this thing works. So the first port, back to the first port, pleasure. Cyrenaicism was the original hedonistic philosophy. These were the true sex, drugs, and rock and roll, to some extent, philosophers of antiquity, not the Epicureans. The Cyrenaics believed that what's important is physical pleasure, not mental stuff. Why? Because physical pleasure is stronger, it's more immediate. And now, physical pleasure now, not the memory of it, not the anticipation of it, or not anything like that. It's just, what you need to do in life is maximize your physical pleasures right now. However, and this is closer to, we argue, what most people naturally do. I mean, a lot of people are sort of unreflective hedonists, so to speak, in day-to-day life. The Cyrenaics were reflective, and one of the things that they pointed out is, certainly pleasure, certainly physical now, but you are the one that is in charge here. You need to own your pleasure, not the other way around, right? So even the sex and drugs and rock and roll analogy is limited, even for the Cyrenaics. The Epicureans were the other hedonistic school, and they were a little bit more sophisticated than the Cyrenaics. They emphasized mental pleasures over physical pleasures. They emphasized the importance of remembrance and as well as anticipation of pleasures. And in fact, the goal of Epicureanism technically was not pleasure per se, was lack of pain, which Epicurus defined as the highest pleasure you can possibly have. The Epicureans were aiming at ataraxia, at tranquility of mind. Essentially, that was the goal. But they did practice their philosophy with virtue, because Epicurus argued that without virtue you actually do not get ataraxia, you don't get tranquility of mind. The second port, that of character, is more credit, and of course you will find there all of the major philosophies that we still discuss today. Well, there's not much discussion of cynicism, and certainly not a lot of practice of cynicism, but they're all in there: Aristotelianism, Platonism, Stoicism, cynicism. In order of appearance, of course, we have Platonism first, then Aristotelianism, then cynicism, and finally Stoicism. Stoicism is the last, the new kid on the block, basically, during Hellenistic philosophy. These are all, in one way or another, these all highlight the importance of character. Character or virtue is either the most important thing by far, or the only thing that is really that really qualifies as a good. So the Aristotelians would say it's the most important thing by far. The Stoics and the Cynics would say it's the only thing that really matters. They differ in their treatment of so-called externals, so things like fame and wealth and health and things like that, right? So for Aristotle, those things are necessary, although they're not sufficient. And if you have them without the practice of virtue, they're not going to do enough for you. According to the Cynics, those things actually get in the way of your eudaimonia, of your good life. And the Stoics kind of struck a compromise, arguing that the externals have value, but they're not, strictly speaking, necessary. So they agreed with the Cynics that virtue is the only thing that truly is a good, but they also agreed with Aristotle that the externals have some degree of value, other things considered. Platonism is complicated. In the book, we only focus on one particular aspect of Platonism, which is the political involvement, working toward a more just world. And hopefully we'll maybe be able to unpack this a little later on. I don't want to take too much time before I throw the ball back to Greg. So the third and final port is that of doubt. Here, as I said, the origin really is Socrates. Now, people might feel a little surprised that we think of Socrates as a skeptic, but in fact, remember, Socrates was the one that went around saying that he didn't know anything, and he was always questioning people. And skeptic doesn't mean somebody who doesn't believe things. It means somebody who inquires. Literally, skeptikos from the Greek means inquirer, right? So Socrates was the ultimate inquirer. It's not necessarily true that he didn't know anything or that his inquiries were completely neutral and he didn't know where they were going. If you read the Socratic dialogues carefully, that's, at least in some of them, that's clearly not the case. But nevertheless, he was constantly engaged in inquiry. The academic skeptics took that straight from Socrates. The academic skeptics, the major figures in that group are Carneades and the Roman Marcus Tullius Cicero. And they came up with some interesting concepts about degrees of belief, and even Cicero even introduced the term probability, probabilis in Latin, to give not quite a modern quantitative account, but a semi-quantitative account of how beliefs can be proportioned to evidence and to arguments. The Platonists were more radical skeptics. Their idea was to suspend judgment about everything. And in fact, their goal was different from the academic skeptics. The academic skeptics, in a sense, thought that the goal was eudaimonia in the same sense as the character schools. The Platonists thought that the goal was ataraxia in the sense of the Epicureans. So even the telos of each one of these schools is different. Just because they fall into the same general approach, that doesn't mean that they have the same goal. And then I mentioned briefly the sophists. The sophists, of course, were the arch enemies of Plato and Socrates, or the other way around, perhaps. It's Plato and Socrates were the arch enemies of the sophists. You have to think of sophistry, the sophistic movement, as well as Platonism, as kind of battling out in Athens for predominance when philosophy was very, very young. And so these people were actually competing in the marketplace of ideas, as we would say today, with each other. But certainly some of the aspects of some of the sophists believe different things. That's why there's no unifying school. But Protagoras, for instance, certainly was a skeptic in the sense that, again, he was inquiring. He wasn't sure that there is always one answer to any particular question. He often engaged in practices that we associate often with either Socrates or the skeptics. And finally, back to the dragon stuff. So Pythagoreanism was the first, arguably, or one of the first philosophies of life. It's very ancient. It flourished in the 6th century BCE. We don't really know much about Pythagoras. Much of what we think we know is really legendary or mythical. He had mystical properties. He's said to go around with a golden tie, which showed that it was divine, and he had magical powers. He probably did not discover or demonstrate the Pythagorean theorem. That was probably one of his students. And he did all sorts of interesting, sometimes bizarre things. The Pythagoreans were allegedly vegetarian. Even that one is not very clear. They believed in reincarnation and and so on and so forth. Among the Megarians, we picked Stilpo as the representative of that school. I should say that each one of these schools in the book is represented by a particular philosopher that we focus on. And Stilpo was very famous at the time in Greece. He was just as well known as today Plato or Aristotle would be. And the Megarians, who were probably one, maybe two, maybe even three different schools that went through or one school that went through three different periods. They were interested in logic, logical puzzles, and the application of logic to ethics. And then finally, we had the Neoplatonists. Those are the ones that really closed the entire period. Neoplatonism comes later. Essentially, we're now in the period where Christianity begins to be a force, and in fact, Neoplatonism eventually gets absorbed by Christianity and provides the explanation for why so much of early Christianity was indirectly influenced by Plato. So that's the overall sort of charting the waters, so to speak. And hopefully we'll get into a little bit more details during the discussion.
Thanks, Massimo. So, with all those things that are presented about how to practice and different philosophies with different techniques, underlying theories, pardon me, as well as ends or what you're supposed to do, there's a natural question, which is, should you be eclectic? Should you kind of mix and match these different philosophies together? And this is the natural tendency of a lot of people. And I think this stems at least from kind of the idea of perennial philosophy in the 19th century, where all philosophies kind of aim toward the same thing. And so you can kind of just do everything because they're all quite similar in many regards and then are going in the same direction. I ultimately think that hypothesis of perennial philosophy is pretty false, but that still doesn't negate the question of whether one can or should mix and match things. And to answer that question briefly before we go into questions as well as small group discussions, one way to answer it is that this is essentially unavoidable, because this is how Stoicism formed. It was essentially eclecticism to start. So Zeno of Citium, according to one of his origin stories, got shipwrecked in Athens, was reading a book, asked the bookseller where he could find a person like the person he was reading about in the book, Socrates. The bookseller pointed him to a Cynic philosopher, Crates, and from there Zeno of Citium started practicing cynicism. After several years of that, of walking through the Athenian marketplace and doing Cynic exercises like carrying essentially what would be considered a poor person's meal, a pot of lentils around in order to embarrass himself, and then his teacher breaking it and it crashing on his thighs and him running away because it looked like he may have had an accident in his pants or in his toga or his other clothing in a sense. He maybe thought to himself, like, maybe there's a little bit more to philosophy than this. And so he moved on and started studying with the Megarians, and then ultimately started also going to Plato's academy and learned some stuff from there and mushed it all together. And that was Stoicism. So in a sense, nothing's really created in a vacuum. And so the question of should you be eclectic is you can't avoid otherwise to some degree. And there are also some upsides to putting some stuff together and into your own kind of philosophy. The first is that you can follow your heart in a sense, that you can take a look and see what you're particularly attracted to and what you think is well suited to you, and go in a direction that matters. And there's quite likely that pardon, in the philosophies that you encounter, that there's going to be some parts of one philosophy that you like and some of another part. And so that's one advantage. Another advantage is that you could pursue multiple teloi. Massimo brought up this technical term of telos, which is an end or the thing toward which something aims. And so each of these philosophies, at least roughly speaking, some of them are arguable, but for the most part, as a first approximation, each of these philosophies kind of aims towards something different. Like, for instance, Cyrenaicism aims toward physical pleasure as the highest good, whereas Epicureanism aims toward mental tranquility, which is a form of pleasure, and in fact, the highest pleasure according to the Epicureans. And so what if you want both? Then you could pursue both by kind of being eclectic here. And thirdly, even if you don't necessarily want to pursue multiple ends, you could still put together tools from other philosophies in order to practice toward your chosen philosophy's specific end. A good example of this is the so-called negative visualization of Stoicism. So Stoicism has this technique where you try to imagine something which is unfortunate happening to you in advance, and various ways, either as if it's happening, or you could journal about it. You could simply remind yourself of that an unfortunate outcome is possible before when going into an event, and you can then become more resilient to that kind of thing. And that was made famous through the Stoics. However, according to Cicero, who was very well versed in the Stoics, he attributes this technique to the Cyrenaics. The Cyrenaics did it as a way to remove mental pain, which is a lesser pain, but still a pain nonetheless, especially if you're going to endure some mental pain in the pursuit of physical pleasure, then that's a great deal. So might as well take away some of the mental pain too in order to get the physical pleasure. And so part of the upside is that you can put together tools toward a single end, even if you only want to pursue one telos or end. But there are also some downsides to being an eclectic. First downside is, again, you could follow your heart. I always regret not remembering this reference of a story, but it was in a Buddhist sitting I was at where I heard a really funny story. I think it was from a Zen monk in Japan, and it was somewhat modern day, where a young man went to go to a monastery, probably a Zen monastery, and the monk picked him up and took him back. And he's like, "So why are you here? What's your point?" And he's like, "Well, I just wanted to follow my heart." And the monk laughed at him and said, "Your heart? Isn't that what got you into all the trouble in the first place that brought you here?" So sometimes following your heart can get you into pain, mental, physical, or otherwise. Doing what comes naturally may take you down the wrong path. So how sure are you that following your heart is the right thing to do? Do you even know what the right thing to do is? If so, how would you figure out what the right thing to do is, what the right path is? Those are all questions which should be explored before going into something, so you minimize, hopefully, the chances of stumbling down the wrong path. But often that's not the approach a lot of people take. Following your heart can lead you into dark alleys. Also, there's inconsistency. The fact that when you're actually practicing one of these, sometimes they will simply contradict. And if you're an eclectic, which way will you go? For instance, Epicureanism wants mental tranquility. Stoicism ultimately wants virtue. If you are not perfected in both, you will have to train to do one or the other. And sometimes giving up mental tranquility to some degree in order to try to do the right thing is something that a Stoic practitioner would suggest. And this is arguable to some degree, and there are nuances here, but an Epicurean, as a rule of thumb, as a rough first approximation, would not recommend that. And so when you're actually trying to practice, if you have multiple philosophies, what are you going to actually do and how are you going to decide? It's like you now need a meta philosophy on top of the philosophy to decide how to practice. And finally, there's also another practical consideration for eclecticism and its downsides, which is analysis paralysis. So as a very brief example, I do practice both kind of Theravadan Buddhism as well as Stoicism. And I often have trouble thinking about how to handle what the Stoics would call an impression. I can either observe its manifestations by practicing first foundation mindfulness, which is a very non-discursive way of dealing with an impression, or I could break it apart, analyze it, look at its implicit value judgments and question them. That's a very analytical approach. What do I do in each situation and how do I choose? And that having that question before me can often slow me down and possibly make my practice worse. So that's also something to decide about eclecticism. So while eclecticism is unavoidable to some degree, it can have quite strong benefits, but also it can have quite strong downsides. So those are some of the things, and you'll be discussing this aspect of eclecticism in a unique way a little bit in the next, in your discussion groups. But for now, I'm going to pause, and here are more information of all of the books as well as where to find Massimo and myself online. And I will hand it back over to Phil, who can let me know what the next steps are and whether we should perhaps go over to general questions before going into the group or stop sharing or anything else. So thank you all for listening, and I'll give it back to Phil.